Time I get to share what we're doing, I'm super excited about it. So, like I said in my intro, I'm the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge-Munsee Community. And being the Director of Cultural Affairs entails that I actually oversee three programs that we have here that fall within our Cultural Affairs Department. First and foremost, we have our library and our museum. Our library houses the largest Mohican archives in the world, and that is thanks to the tedious and dedicated work of community members that started with the collection of items started back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But it really started with the inception of colonization and our leaders taking it upon themselves to write our histories down. So I really owe them a mad amount of respect for being keepers of our history and having that here. And so we have, like I said, the largest collection of Mohican archives in the world. You want to know anything about the Mohican people, please send us an email. We can help you. And if we can't, we can point you in a direction that can. In addition to that, we do have the museum side of our building, which houses items of cultural and well, basically cultural significance to us, and tells the story of who we are, who the Mohican people are, from our times on the East Coast when we were in the Hudson River Valley, Mahicanatech River Valley, to parts of Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Vermont, and yes, even Kansas. We had some removal in Indiana and in Kansas as well. So we cover a vast part of the out east, and that's where a lot of our history is. And so items that, we tell that story about where we were out east through our Trail of Tears, through our removal to Wisconsin. But then we also have items that can act as visuals and that storytelling as well, and who the Mohican and Munsee people are. Then, in addition to that, we have our historic preservation program, which is tasked with preserving and protecting sites of cultural significance in our homelands. And so when I say our homelands again, that's the Mahicanatech River Valley, so those parts of New York, and then kind of where like Albany is, and then south a little bit, and then parts of Massachusetts, which take up the Berkshires. If you're familiar with the Berkshires, we have a significant history there in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, obviously because our name is Stockbridge-Munsee. So that plays a significant role. Parts of Vermont, parts of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. So we have a vast amount of land that we want to protect, and there are sites of cultural significance that we do protect out there. And a lot of our work is done through Section 106 consultations, which are triggered by the National Historic Preservation Act. But then on top of that, we also work with NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. I have to think about that when I say it. But what this act allows us to do is it allows us to work in consultation with museums and other buildings or sites of cultural institutions to allow us to bring our ancestors home, get them off those museum shelves, repatriate them, bring them home, and give them the proper burial that they deserve. It also, though, allows us to work within NAGPRA and cultural patrimony to bring home items of cultural significance as well that are sitting in museums. And so that's really important to us. And that helps us be able to be the keepers of our history and the keepers of our story. And we think that's super important. Lastly, what I also oversee is our language program. And this is a program that officially became part of the department just over a year ago, but it's been obviously a work in progress in the community. We're unique in the fact that we have two recognized languages in our community. We have our Munsee language, and we also have our Mohican language. Our Munsee language, there was a huge push in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to bring that language back to the community. There were speakers of Munsee language across the country. And just like any languages, there are different dialects. So different communities spoke different dialects. And the community that spoke most to what closest to what we would have probably have spoke, our Munsee ancestors, were in Canada. And so what a group of community members went to Canada, and they learned the language, and they started to bring it back. Like they went to immersion camps and really learned it, because there were fluent speakers of the Munsee language still. There are Munsee speakers also in Oklahoma with Delaware Nation and Delaware Tribe. They are ancestors of ours, because some went to Canada and some had to continue to move out west. So we speak different dialects, but it's very similar. The other thing that we've been doing is we've been waking up our Mohican language. This was a language that was all but dead. The last fluent speaker of Mohican language died in the 1930s, and there have been no fluent speakers of this language since then. What's really exciting is the way that this language revitalization is happening. And it's basically through a grant that we had through IMLS. We were able to find a linguist who works in Indigenous languages who was able to help us kind of revitalize this language through documentation only, because there's no sound, there's nobody who can speak it. So we were able to use documentation as far back as the catechisms that were written in English that were translated into Mohican to help convert us to Christianity. So we were able to use those as well as written documentation to kind of help bring this language back to life. Is it the same Mohican that our ancestors spoke? Absolutely not. But it's so similar that we like to think that if we were back in our homelands and we were speaking this language, our ancestors would be able to understand us, which is super exciting. So we call it our Stockbridge Mohican. It's not just Mohican, it's our Stockbridge Mohican. But it's really exciting to be part of this and to see it happening. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about that and our history as we go through. But the language portion of it, all of it's really interesting. But the revitalization of this Mohican language is super exciting, and I'm very excited to share it with you all.
This also brings me to this idea of not just decolonizing language in terms of the language we're speaking, but this idea from Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book, Decolonizing the Mind, that's fantastic, where he talks about one of the aspects of language as culture is an image forming agent in the mind of a child. Our capacity to confront the world creatively is dependent on how those things correspond or not to that reality, how they distort or clarify the reality of our struggles. And this totally blew me away when I read it, and thinking about these different ways of even the subtleties of being able to describe the environment around you in a true way, and what that means.
Not being able to use our language, or not being able, actually having it legislated, that you could not, speak in your language or pray in your language, or I'm actually in the process of reading a biography of a very good, very amazing Indigenous leader. And she was talking about how, if you spoke your Indigenous language, the government could deem you like incompetent to handle your own affairs. And so I found that really interesting. But then another thing too, because as I'm a historian first. And so when you think about the history of it, of not being able to use your language, that can really mess with your mind when you're then told we need you to use your language. For example, in terms of the Navajo code talkers, they were products of boarding schools. I went to boarding schools, and if you know anything about boarding schools, I'm not going to go into a history of them, but they were awful. And the first thing you did is you were given a Christian name, and you couldn't speak your language anymore. And then we are in a time of war, and it's a world war, it's a big war, and we have to figure out a way to get our messages across without this code being broken. And so one of the things they suggest is Navajo, because it's such a complex language and it's not written down. It was not written down at this time. And so it was when you read interviews with some of the code talkers, it was it totally messed with your mind. You were in this a situation where you couldn't speak your language, and now you're being asked to speak your language because you're trying to preserve, freedoms and win a war. And so that really, really can mess with somebody. And I think using, in some ways, with us using our language now, with revitalizing it, trying to bring it back and using it in our ways, I think it's kind of almost I'm not very eloquent, but a big middle finger to everyone in the past who was like, we need you to use it for this, or you can't use it at all. And here, and using it to, convert to Christianity, that forced conversion. And now we're taking that back and we're saying, no, 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 no. Now we're going to use it in our ceremonies. Now we're going to use it when talking to our children, to our elders, to whomever. And one of the goals that I have for us for this language is we do host these language classes online. They're virtual because of the pandemic. But one of my goals is when we're able to gather in person, not far from here, is a Lutheran mission boarding school that a lot of people from this particular reservation and surrounding reservations went to that school. My grandparents included. That's where my grandparents met. One of my ultimate goals is to host a language class on those grounds, and kind of a way to take it back and, for lack of better words, say, screw you, we're learning our language again. And this is who we are, and this is super important. And I think it helps us in telling the narrative of our own stories. And I think that's super important.
Looking to Aotearoa or New Zealand and the way that their government has Maori language strategy goals that include everybody. And they've made a bunch of goals that are like, by 2028, we want this % of everybody speaking the Maori language. And, we want to, by 2028, we want to strengthen the educational opportunities for these things so that it's not pigeonholing people, but just saying like, right, we want to actually make these resources available in all educational schools so that, and that's where I didn't mention the language pods that the Hawaiian language pods are based on are originally from Aotearoa. And that was so successful, but now they're trying to expand it in a way that's super exciting to see, to say, okay, well, we want this to be just a part of education, and we want to encourage everybody to learn it. And that's something you can be proud of, being from New Zealand and speaking this language. Do you have a lot of people that are not Indigenous that are interested in the language classes, or what's the mix?
We do. We actually have a pretty good mixture of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people learning it. People from Canada, people from out east in our homelands, and are also learning the language as well. And then we're also working towards, particularly once we have the Mohican language a little bit further along, and because we're developing curriculum at the same time, we're hoping to get it into schools, to learn. And in part of that decolonizing, though, I would encourage schools, once we get it in there, to not deem Indigenous languages as a foreign language, because they're not foreign. Because if any language was foreign in the United States, it was English. Before colonization, we were speaking Mohican and Munsee and Hawai'i and Lakota and Potawatomi and Ojibwe. Those are the Indigenous languages of this land. They're not foreign. So I think when we talk about decolonization, once the languages get into the school, it's how to present them in a way that does them honor, I think, is also super important.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that, not to share too much publicly, but about the project I'm working on with Roomful of Teeth for that we've been talking about, also applying for funding for some of the educational materials that we have based on all of the kind of wave and sea and boulder behavior that's being created in English by the scientist who is initiated the project, but to then partner with local Hawaiian science teachers to translate those materials into Hawaiian so that we could go into Hawaiian immersion schools and do the program and have that as a part of the thing where, you know, I've taught in other languages and I don't mind embarrassing myself. I think the kids, you know, my Hawaiian isn't perfect, but I think, you know, in like in any other language, just that the kids are excited to help you and they want to, they're so happy to see you trying. And, you know, I think with partnering with local experts and then showing them, this is something I'm learning too, I'm really excited about it. When I was talking to the organizers locally about it, they said, yeah, this is a problem. We don't always have teaching artists that speak Hawaiian. And so we don't have programs that can integrate into the immersion schools in the same way. And so, you know, not just as an arts thing, but to really, okay, well, cool, let's create the curriculum, the science curriculum. It's already there with all of the wayfinding, hokulea stuff. We have a bridge that they'd probably be talking about in their science class anyway. Why don't we create more of this curriculum that creates work for local science teachers, work for local translators, and also then makes this greater bridge into the schools. And I think that that can be a really powerful thing, like you were saying, to have it more integrated, that it's not just a language class, but that it can find these other ways to integrate and honestly relate to kids more. Kind of as a teacher, a kid might not be as interested in kind of you know, storytelling or something, but they might be super into science or they might be really into sports. And if you have different ways of integrating language into those other things, then they want to, they're excited about that and they want to learn because it's something that they're interested in participating in.
I 100%. I think, I mean, you can even use the incorporation of Indigenous games to lacrosse. You can definitely incorporate, you know, language into lacrosse or chaha or even of the other Indigenous games that are out there. So you're out there, you're being active, number one, which is important. We want you to be active. You're learning a traditional game, but you're also learning the language at the same time. And that's super, super important. And I think one of the other things that we have to realize too, and I know it's something that I have struggled with because I did not introduce myself in Indigenous language because number one, I haven't learned it completely yet, but number two, I think it is just for me, and I'm sure I'm not the only Indigenous person out there to deal with this, but there's like, for me personally, and this is just getting personal, I have a block. There's a block of learning the language, and I'm not sure what that block is yet. And I know we do suffer with that intergenerational trauma and that intergenerational depression, and that does feed into that. So I feel like also being welcoming and embracing people who maybe they just want to sit in class. They might not want to speak it yet. They might not want to participate, but they want to hear it. Because when you hear it, it's good for the soul. It's medicine for your soul. But like for me, I do have an Indigenous name. I had a naming ceremony last year, but I don't always, I don't use it, and I don't, you know, speak. I speak words here and there, like I'll say thank you or I love you, but nothing super, you know, like deep. And I think there's just that block. So I think also having these spaces of learning, these spaces where people can just sit and listen and heal before they jump into that learning process, I think is super important as well.
Absolutely. I heard that echoed in some of the, yeah, did you hear the Emergence Magazine series that they did, the podcasts?
I have not, no, not yet.
It's so beautiful. It's so, so beautiful. But there were actually a lot of people that were helping their parents record, like the kids of the last, you know, there's, I wish I could remember the name right now, but there's this woman who was helping videotape her dad and her auntie. And they just get together and they're giggling and they're speaking and it's like so sweet, but she doesn't speak it. And there were a lot of people on that, you know, were saying the same exact thing, that they don't speak themselves, and echoing that sentiment. And I think that Yeah, absolutely. But still being around it and being,
Mhm.
you know, and opening up that space. And as a kind of aside, I have a viola student that I am still teaching that I met more than 10 years ago, because he wanted to come to this beginning violin class and just listen. But he was terrified to play in front of everybody. And the teacher was going to kick him out of the class. And I thought, any 5-year-old who wants to wake up an hour early to come listen to another bunch of 5-year-olds, you know, play open strings and sound, you know, kind of out of tune. Like any kid who is so focused and just wants to listen, like I 100% will go teach that kid, you know, or just hang out with him, because he was so patient and so, you know, kind and really sensitive. And, you know, I'm still, you know, I've gotten back in touch with him, and I've been giving him Zoom classes for fun, just to be in touch. And he's 16 now. But
Wow.
just, you know, that it just took him a while to feel comfortable. And I think that you know, and like you were saying, and whether or not he becomes a musician is not the point, you know.
Exactly.
As a teacher, it was fostering that spirit and honoring that, like, that's a wonderful way to experience this thing, is to be listening and to be present. And those are values that are really, really important. And so I think that's another way that through language revitalization, you know, that's similar to music, that's the idea of a community space where listening and presence are valued in a different way. And they're not about outcomes and necessarily having everybody be a native speaker. They're about recentering and valuing that kind of community practice and that kind of empathy in a different way.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
I'm having so much fun talking to Heather that I'm not looking at questions, but are there any other questions? Or Vic, do you want to introduce some questions?
Sure. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but firstly, there was just one note. Heather, could you give the title of the biography you referenced?
Oh, yeah. I'm currently reading Making a Difference. It's the memoir of Ada Deer. She was the first female leader of the Menominee Restoration Committee after they came out of termination. And it was in that book that I learned the whole big thing. But basically, there was a vote that needed to happen at one point between the Menominee and the US government. And the US government appointed like guardians for those who spoke Menominee because they were considered incompetent. And it's kind of the same thing that they did with the Osage in the 1920s when there was oil found on the Osage Reservation in Oklahoma. They were given guardians to kind of see over their money because if they spoke Osage, they were not considered civilized. And a good book about that is Killers of the Flower Moon is a good one that you can read about that. And it talks about the Osage and everything that happened there.
So we have another couple of questions coming in, but I wonder if this is a nice time for people if they wanted to put their videos on so we can see people. Heather and Leilehua, would you be okay with that? So that we can, yeah, join the room. That's great. There's another question from Elizabeth Martin. If you're presenting historic material, how can one balance a quote Western European perspective and Indigenous perspective without minimizing one or the other?
Okay, this is a good question. And I hope you don't mind if I step in and answer this, because first and foremost, I'm a historian and I study, like that's what I went to school for. And so, excuse me, my first reaction to that question is who really cares if you're minimizing the Western or European experience, because that's all you learn about in school. From the time you are in kindergarten, when you're standing up and you're saying the Pledge of Allegiance, until the time you graduate college, unless you're taking really specific classes, you're learning the European version of history. You're learning the European version of the American Revolution. You're not learning about the Haudenosaunee or the Mohican who fought in that revolution to help, the United States gain its freedom. You're learning about the Civil War from a Eurocentric viewpoint. You're not learning that during the Civil War in 1862, there was a 6-week uprising by the Dakota people because they were starving, and the United States fell down, not surprisingly, but fell down on their treaty obligations. You're not learning about that. You're not learning that, about the American Indian movement and the fight for treaty rights. So you're already learning a very Eurocentric view. So in my opinion, you shouldn't worry about trying to minimize one side of history. History is written by the victors. You're already getting the one side. What you have to worry about and what you should be worrying about is indigenizing that curriculum and making sure that you are telling an inclusive history, regardless of whether or not you minimize the European perspective, because who cares? We already learned it. We already know it. That's the point of view you're always told. You have to bring in the other points of view. So you have to do the work to do it in. And it doesn't have to be a both sides. It doesn't have to be balanced news because it's so completely unbalanced. You have to work at bringing in that history. And I can guarantee you, you can bring in Indigenous history of the American Revolution. You can bring in Indigenous history of the Boston Massacre in 30 seconds. The first person to die in the Boston Massacre was a man by the name of Crispus Attucks, who was of Afro and Indigenous descent. I did it in less than 30. You just brought in Indigenous history. So who cares if you're playing one side up or the other? Since the concept of history of the United States, the Indigenous perspective and the perspective of communities of color has always been diminished. So in terms of minimizing a European side, who really cares at that point? Because it's the history we're already learning. That was my soapbox. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I said that I lived in China for a year when I was in high school. I did a junior year abroad, and subsequently it meant that I have never taken a European history course. I took several years of Asian history in high school, especially because I was living in China. And then I was an East Asian studies major in college along with music. And so I was doing more of that. And so it's funny to say that also though, because as you said, Heather, I have a doctorate in viola performance. Like all of the history, all of the music stuff that I did was absolutely European history classes, but just not through that kind of historical lens. So, it actually took me a long time to feel like I wasn't catching up, because I kept thinking like, oh, I have to catch up. I don't know what all these other people know. And no, it was just a different lens. And it meant that I have a weird reference point of, when I hear about things that I'm probably going to relate it to, Monteverdi or something instead of some revolution. But, I turned out okay, maybe. We'll see. I think Zach had a question, and Vic, is there other?
No, Zach, you should go ahead.
Hi, my name is Zach. I'm joining from the land of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts people. I'm a white guy with curly hair who kind of badly needs a shave. And I'm the managing director of the Switch Ensemble. We're pleased to be commissioning Leilehua's new work, Kanaka. And thank you both so much for today. I've been reflecting on a conversation we had once, Leilehua, around land acknowledgements and arts organizations participating in land acknowledgements. And I expressed some skepticism around the ways that predominantly white institutions in particular will capitalize on land acknowledgements as a way to be seen trying and talk about how they want to be perceived without actually meaningfully investing in any sort of distribution of capital or reparation or meaningful action. And you pushed back on me a little bit and you said, it's no joke how meaningful that can be on its own, just because like the erasure of language has been so important for so long. So I'm wondering, for folks who are coming from, arts organizations, universities, museums, and so on, are there additional or further specific actions you would recommend that do provoke this kind of awareness, or that oblige, bringing the conversation in? To Heather's point, it's so easy and so quick in some cases just to, bring in an important and meaningful element of, say, history that's often forgotten. So that's part one. Are there little and concrete, tangible things that can be done easily? The second part of the question is, awareness is just one step towards meaningful action and reparation and investment and, equity. Are there organizations you can think of that are models to look to who are turning that corner and doing a really good job of sort of meaningful action, policy change, structural change? Thinking specifically in this case, sort of within an arts context, since that's one thing we've talked about today.
Yeah, so in terms of your second question first, in cultural or educational institutions, serious change in policy takes time. And so there's not one that I can list off that, boom, they did it. But I know for us personally, for me personally, we're working with different organizations that are located in Mohican homelands that are wanting to make changes. Right off the bat, smaller organizations, the first one I can think of is Soul Fire Farm. They have a farm that's located on Mohican lands, and we have a very good relationship with them because Soul Fire is amazing. And so they definitely are very aware of Mohican history, aware of history of the enslaved people who also worked on that land after we were removed. So they're amazing. Secondly, to your first question, is a land acknowledgement means jack if there's not an action item in there. They're just words on a paper, pretty words on a paper, but you have to put something behind that. So I think when an institution is going to work on a land acknowledgement, it has to be a living land acknowledgement. There's got to be something in there that promotes education or information about whose land they're on. And I think oftentimes land acknowledgements, I do a whole workshop on land acknowledgements. So I think a lot of times they get stuck in the past. They acknowledge the past, which is great, but you have to acknowledge the contemporary as well. So for example, with the land acknowledgement we worked on with EMPAC, it didn't just stop, this is the home of the Mohican people. That's it. It talks about where we are now, who we are now. And I think that's so important to point that out. So I like the idea of a living land acknowledgement. It can change. I mean, words are living and breathing, and they can change as they need to change. And I think same thing with a land acknowledgement. It can change as it needs to change. There just has to be some sort of action put behind those words or the words just mean nothing at all. So I hope that answered your question, but that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Zach, we talked about this a bunch because of our project too. But I think just looking at, thinking about the presentation that you gave at Chamber Music America, Zach, is that actually, I don't know if that's available, but Zach gave this wonderful presentation at Chamber Music America about how to talk to granting organizations and kind of some of the advice that we get in talking to places is doing this elevator pitch. But if you're not somebody from the same culture as the person that you're trying to give the elevator pitch to, and you're saying decolonization is a really big part of my work, and they don't understand what that means, that you can't give an elevator pitch in the same way. You can't relate to the donors, and you can't relate to the people that you're trying to connect with on your side in the same quick way. And so another reason I think that, to Heather's point of like, include these people in your history, it only takes 30 seconds, or, you know, find ways to do a living land acknowledgement, or, you know, these ways. And what I had said before was just kind of being a part of the Native Launchpad community that I've found this year, that it was really powerful to me to hear a lot about, you know, like I just hear people speaking their languages which I miss from not being in Hawaii, but also just miss, and it's like exciting to me to hear that the more little interactions like that people have, perhaps to your point, Zach, about kind of breaking down those walls of talking to people, that those conversations that we have with people when we're saying, you know, like Heather needs a new building for this community thing, and they're doing this kind of work, and they've heard enough of those little things that they're like, oh, we get it. We get why this is important. And so like, yes, some of those things can seem like they're perfunctory, but I think kind of added up and with a kind of continuous, as Heather was saying, with continuous action and continuous intention, I think that those things can make some of these other broader conversations that we're trying to have in the industry easier, slowly through time.
There's one more question. There's one more question from Mariana, but I just wanted to also just say thank you so much to both of you for this incredibly generous conversation, and I feel like we could speak literally all day about this, but also just in terms of like thinking through art institutions, you know, I think that, I mean, particularly of course when when Indigenous languages were unsanctioned, but even more now, I feel like it's artists that are practicing language justice. You know, it's the artists. It's through visual art. It's through music, like with what we're talking about here today. It's through film. It's through poetry, particularly that these conversations can happen, and that a greater knowledge and kind of sensory understanding of these languages as well comes into the world. So I just wanted to say that, but also Mariana has a question, and I wanted just to promote a little Mariana EMPAC program that's happening in a month, which in some ways is really following directly on from this conversation. Mariana's moderating a conversation with current EMPAC artist in residence, Clarissa Tosin, and the two Maya artists, Rosa Chavez and Tehil Fidel Brito. And that's also happening in a month. And really, it'll be really interesting to hear these conversations back to back, because it's really pulling on similar threads around exactly what we're saying here. Anyway, sorry, Mariana.
Thank you both for all the stories you've shared. This has been fantastic, and to Vic for letting me take part in the space. This might be a good jumping off point, but I've been reading recently on Sky Hopinka, and he published a poetry book. And in one of the introductory essays, Julie Niemi talks about how Sky was teaching her how to say her name in Chinukwawa, and that there's like a gesture in the language for just like, I don't know, that's very like normalized and unstigmatized, which I just like, I mean, personally, it's been very different from my experience, like trying to learn German in grad school, for example. And I just, yeah, I mean, this is more a comment than a question, but I'm wondering like if there's something similar in your experience in Stockbridge Mohican, in Hawaiian, and like maybe also how we can think about this like pedagogy of I don't know, or like ongoingness in like learning about Indigenous cultures more widely.
So for us, in particularly with the revitalization of Mohican, there is so much that we don't know. And so that's why particularly, I mean, we do this in our Munsee classes as well, but if you don't know the word, or if you can't say the word, or you say it, but you say it differently, there's no like right or wrong. So we're kind of just encouraging people to join and start speaking, because to be frank, none of us are speaking it right, because we're not speaking the exact dialect of Mohican that our ancestors would have spoken. So I mean, very early on, we got used very quickly to saying that I don't know, or we'll have to research that and find it out. And we're literally creating words as we're going. So it's, I mean, I had a professor in college when I told him I was going to embark on lecturing and things like that. He said, you know, when your students ask you a question and you don't know the answer, it's okay to say, you know, I have no idea, but I'm going to get back to you on that. So we've kind of embraced that with this revitalization of Mohican, that we don't know, we're working on it. We're learning right along with you. So that's kind of where we are with that.
Yeah, I think I said a little bit before, but I really reiterate the you know, don't tell Auntie she's wrong comment in the Hawaiian book, which we love. Even kind of transcribing some videos last week to help out with another project. You know, I was kind of emailing back and forth with this curator because I was like, well, when I grew up, like we spelled this as one word, but now I'm seeing it spelled as two words. And like, that looks terrible to me because I'm used to seeing it as this, and, you know, and just kind of negotiating and having that conversation, I think, is a part of the language being alive. You know, that is so important. It means the language is alive because we're making up words, and we're, you know, and we're trying to navigate things in the same way that, you know, the modern dictionary is updated, and Merriam-Webster adds words and kind of to be with the times and to be relevant, you know. So that I think it's a way of reinforcing, like, the not knowing is about the fact that it is alive, and that these languages are still living, and that that's a part of not knowing, because not knowing and learning, as someone who comes from a teaching background more, is, you know, that's what's exciting, is the not knowing. That's gives us energy to keep learning and to keep studying, and it means the language is alive.